Hi, and welcome everyone. We're so happy to have you here. So I just put in the chat in YouTube, those of you joining us, we'd love to hear where you're calling in from. My name is Maria Coriel Martin. I'm the founder of Art Toolkit, and I'm so thrilled to be here today with I guess we're old friends now. It's been a lot of years with Claire Giordano, artist, adventurer, writer, instructor. You wear a lot of wonderful hats, Claire. And you have just taken the most fabulous art adventures from artist residencies all around what seems like the United States. And you run Adventure Art Academy. And you're here today to share some backcountry watercolor techniques to help inspire us because, oh my gosh, it's finally here. It's spring. Oh, so thank you for being here, Claire.
Thanks for having me, Maria, and hello to everybody who's tuning in with a live stream and then later with the recording. I'm so happy to be here, and it's always such a fun and an honor to be able to chat with Maria because we've known each other now for going on almost 13 years. I met her, she was teaching in the field, and I had the privilege of learning from her like below Mount Baker in the North Cascades. And that was just such a really, when I look back on it, a really transformative and impactful experience, even though it was pouring rain and my painting got all soggy and just, the ink ran everywhere, but I still have the painting and I really love it because it was the first time that I kind of experienced how art could be this really wonderful kind of medium for connection between people and place. For me, it helped me understand and connect with climate change and how that was impacting a landscape that I was coming to deeply care about and love when I was spending so much time there. So now I feel like I kind of have carried that same experience and message into kind of all of what I do as an artist, whether I'm working in the studio or out in the field on my own trips or out in the field doing art residencies, of which I've had the great privilege of doing some with scientists and some with public land. And I think I've done 12 of them now, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Claire, I just have to mention too, because to everyone joining us, we will be launching the last remaining palettes of this cool project, the Icy Fjords palettes. And I'm bringing this up because we are donating 10% of proceeds from this palette, which is custom filled with 10 watercolors by the Art of Soil, to Inspiring Girls Expeditions. And this is the program that you and I first met on, was Inspiring Girls Expeditions, at the time called Girls on Ice. And it continues to be a passion for us too, thinking about art, science, and education. And I'm so excited that we'll be donating more than $2,000 to the program to help support the logistics and the gear. And I love that it was such an influence for you, and it's had a big influence on me, and getting outside and having adventures and learning to see the world through different perspectives.
That's so amazing. Oh my gosh. And that palette looks so beautiful. I didn't already have the other paints I was working with. I was definitely going to get one. And that's just such a neat thing. I think what a wonderful, connection that we've both had to this one certain landscape and to this program that also impacted our lives. And I encourage folks, if you don't know about Inspiring Girls Expeditions, just to go check out the organization. And if you know of any young women who are within the age ranges that they look for, it's a wonderful opportunity. It's fully funded. So it's, pretty special that they have this program that tries to empower young women in the field science and wilderness settings, especially through leadership and art too.
And today you're going to help inspire us to get out a little bit, maybe further than like our parks, or maybe where we just go during a day hike even. Can you dive in with a little bit of what a little bit of background and what you're going to share today?
And I have some fun photos to share shortly, but before I do, I love to paint outside, and my favorite is to paint outside a little bit farther out than I think most folks might envision when they hear the word plein air. That's honestly one of the reasons why I don't use the word plein air necessarily to describe my work. I describe them as field paintings because I feel, I resonate more with the kind of way that a field scientist will talk about, how far they're going and what they're seeing and observing. And I try to integrate kind of that more holistic experience into what I'm doing. And very often plein air artists, we kind of have this vision of someone, working by the side of a road or a lookout with this really big, bulky setup of easel and oil paints. And I'm kind of at the other extreme where I have as little as I possibly can get away with, because I'm oftentimes carrying every little iota and every gram of that weight with me, sometimes for many, many miles, sometimes just for a day hike.
I relate. Yeah. So what you carry needs to matter.
And it has to be very, like, so everything's really intentional. And it's been, I think it's I love gear. I'm a total gear nerd. I worked at REI for a number of years. So I just every year nerd out on like really kind of delving into and being really intentional about what's the equipment I'm carrying. You know, is each little bit serving the purpose of my goals as an artist, and then also enabling me to not have too much extra weight in the backpack, especially because the last couple of years, as I've started to film my Adventure Art Academy classes, and I'm also sometimes close to a viewpoint, other times I'm 50 miles from the trailhead, that's an extra bundle of equipment and stuff I have to carry. So I kind of had to become just even more streamlined in what I carry with my painting equipment. And because I think there's, at least for me personally, there's kind of a lot of beauty in the simplicity of just having just what I need to be able to create and not having any extra stuff that I'd be tempted to use or be worried about using. Because that's one reason why I don't carry a sketchbook, because I would always get really intimidated by having to be perfect in pages that felt so permanent. And I can talk more about that in a little bit too.
Yeah, but practice, not perfection. It's just
exactly.
paper. It's just paper, everybody.
Exactly. That's why I carry loose leaf. You know, I love like having just little paintings that I can, you know, bop in and out of my little carrying case, and it makes it just so much for me. Like it was that mental hurdle in a sketchbook was, you know, I could not get over that. So as soon as I took my paintings out of a sketchbook onto loose leaf paper, it was kind of like a light bulb went off. I was like, oh, okay, I'm just here to explore and experiment, and the result doesn't matter, because what matters for me is the overall experience of having fun in the backcountry. So that's kind of my goal.
And we all need to find out what works for us, what feels comfortable. And everyone, I did put a note in the chat, and that if you do have any questions at any time, I am keeping an eye on it. And so I'll do my best to relay them. So do keep us posted as we go. We're so glad to have you all here.
And it won't bother me. Go ahead and ask your questions. And I also do just want to say that, you know, while the kind of context of, you know, my materials and stuff is, you know, my goal of sometimes going pretty far out from a trailhead, when I think of the word adventure, I really try to embody when I teach and when I'm painting the idea that every painting is an adventure, whether you are at home painting or you are out 50 miles from the trailhead, because adventure at heart is kind of being in the space of outside of our comfort zone. And for me, almost every painting pushes me in some way outside of my comfort zone. So I would never want someone to think that because they may not be able or may not have access to backcountry locations or wilderness locations, that doesn't detract in any way, I think, from your ability to use art as a way to connect with place.
100%.
Yay. So I want to share some fun photos with you all. It's kind of just a way to hopefully give some kind of context to just this idea of, you know, what materials I choose and why, and how do I carry my materials with me. So I'm going to switch here. Let me know, Maria, when you can see my screen.
Yeah, we've got it.
Okay, sweet. And I think it's just a screen and no longer my face. That way I can look over to the left and not distract you all with my looking back and forth between monitors. So there's a little photo from the North Cascades. And this is actually right outside a parking lot. I'm like a 10-minute walk from my car here, which is one of the amazing things about being in Washington State. And when I carry my materials with me on a backpacking trip, the little white kind of envelope on the front of my backpack, that's a Tyvek sleeve. And Tyvek is a really awesome material that often is used to enclose and wrap houses because it's permeable for water vapor, but not for liquid water. So my paintings will stay amazingly dry in there if it's really bad weather. I inadvertently tested it once. I forgot to put the rain fly on my backpack and it definitely got pretty soaked, but the paintings stayed almost completely dry. So I carry them in there both for protection from water, but also from branches and other junk that I might be running my pack into. And this new pack I have does have some bungee cords. So that 11 by 14 inch, envelope and with a stiff backing board in there just slides right onto the back of the backpack. I have a sit pad behind it. And then everything kind of stays on there pretty well. And so far, nothing's fallen off. It's adhered on there pretty good. And then the rest of the backpack, this was a trip where we were out for a number of days and I had some extra, I try to keep the extra stuff off the backpack, but we had like the ice axe and some camp shoes. And then I'll note that on the very top, that's Mr. Stinky. And that's my jar to carry out human waste. In the last few years, I've really leaned into, the leave no trace principle of really trying to dispose of human waste properly, especially in high use environments. So I've made a personal choice that wherever possible, I do pack out my waste. And that's not what everybody wants to do, but for me personally, in areas where there's super high traffic, it's no longer really tenable, and there's research to back this up, to be leaving waste behind, even if it's buried properly. So, Mr.
Claire,
Stinky.
curious too, do you use that approach to watercolor paint, like the you're mixing water?
That's a good question. So for my mixing water, and I'll show you guys what I use for my water tin. It's a really tiny tin. So I have very, very little water in there, and the vast majority of my pigment ends up on a paper towel. So as long as there's not much pigment left in that little jar, then as long as it's almost clear water, basically, then I'll just dump it and I don't worry about it. But if it's super highly pigmented, I will just use a paper towel, soak it up, put the paper towel like in the tin, basically. And then once it's sunny back at camp, open everything up, let it dry. So that way the vast majority of pigment is coming home with me.
That's really
There's only a couple, there's only a couple of situations where I really won't leave any pigment behind. And that's if I'm in any scientific research sites where they have instrumentation sensitive enough to possibly pick up on the few pigments I have that are heavy metal based, like cobalts. So I've had a couple amazing situations where they're like, do not use that pigment. So this is, again, just another photo of, you can see like that little envelope doesn't stick out that much. It's really easy to carry. And with all of my extra art equipment and filming equipment, I'm able to keep my pack at a pretty reasonable weight for me, which is usually 35 to 45 pounds, depending on length of the trip. I'm not a super huge person, so I like to try to keep my pack as light as I can. That's fun. Yeah, so this photo here, this is actually for if I'm carrying a bigger painting, which occasionally does happen. On day hikes, that whole sleeve just gets tucked inside of my day pack. Everything fits inside, it's out of the way, and then I don't have to worry about things falling off. But if I want to work bigger, this is a half sheet of watercolor here. This is in the French Alps. I just strap it on with a little bit of cordage and I'm good to go. It took a little bit of finagling to figure out the best arrangement, but this has stayed on in really high wind. So I was quite happy with my, with my arrangement there. Once on the blue moon, I will take a acrylic setup with me. I haven't actually done it since this trip because it was just so much work and so much heavier, but it was really fun. I literally carried this canvas and paints pretty high up on Mount Baker, which was super fun. And I had it in a plastic bag because it was pretty damp and wet during that trip. So once the paint was dry enough, just got tucked in there. So I do work in acrylic in the studio quite a bit, but in the field, watercolor is by far my favorite because, as you can see in this photo, watercolor is just so simple. I oftentimes spend the vast majority of my time just sitting. I don't bring an easel out with me. I have a little sit pad, which makes it much more comfortable. Oftentimes I'm just cross-legged and just with stuff kind of in my lap. It's the only time you'll see me like propping things up with a fake easel as if I'm trying to film a class, which always gets entertaining with like a backpack and boots and rocks trying to make this little easel. And my students get a good laugh when a gust of wind comes and everything topples over.
But you are conscientious, and I do the same thing about covering up for the sun. I love a sun hoodie, a good hat. I mean, when you are out there painting and there's not shade, that's something that matters, is taking care of yourself. Oh my gosh. And this right here is not even full sun mode. You may bring up such a wonderful point. So normally I would have the hood up and I actually even wear sun gloves too. And when I was in Utah last summer, even though it was super duper hot, if I was in the sun, I had full coverage on basically. So none of my skin was in the sun because I burn super easily. And let me tell you, you only burn in between your fingers while painting once until you decide that wearing gloves is definitely the way to go. And it can be, sometimes it's even worse if you're in the snow. So like this photo was from a residency last spring at Crater Lake, and I got a couple of beautiful, wonderful sunny days. But it was so blindingly bright. So I was, even with the hoodie on and this hat and gloves, the reflected light off the snow can still burn you. So I was having to put so much sunscreen like on the bottom of my nose, inside my nose, bottom of my chin, like anything not exposed or not covered. It was just, I feel like if my students could see me, sometimes they would just laugh at like how much sunscreen I'm wearing. You can get burned in some really awkward places on the snow.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Nose, roof your mouth. Like if you're on snow for a long time, don't keep your mouth open. That one's painful. And in the snow, I'll also bring an extra bit, like a bigger sit pad, because I'm often asked, how do I stay there for so long? Anywhere from 15 minutes to 3 hours somewhere painting. And honestly, having that sit pad I've always used one, and the bigger ones make it so much more comfortable on snow. And it just really makes it so much more comfortable. And I know that sitting cross-legged on the ground is not accessible to everyone. So a number of artists I know will bring a little teeny tiny stool to sit on because their hips and knees like that better. I'm fortunate in that my body is happy to sit there like that for a while, but not everybody is. As I mentioned, I very occasionally bring a sketchbook. And then I usually get too intimidated by the sketchbook and then it sits on my shelf looking pretty. So I prefer loose leaf paper. And this is one of the rare occasions where I'm in shorts, but I was in the shade. And this was like a 105-degree day in Escalante, Utah last year, where I would wake up as early as possible, be hiking before sunrise to try to do a painting and a hike, and then be done by noon because it was just so unbelievably warm. But the loose leaf paper, you can see, you know, I have a couple in these photos here, like the one on my left of the screen. That painting didn't turn out. And for me, it was just like, okay, no problem. Like I'll still stick it on the wall. I can enjoy it. I can learn from it, but it wasn't stuck in like this artifact of a sketchbook. The loose leaf paper also just saves me a lot of weight. You can imagine backpacking, having stuff that's loose and tiny and small just gives me more flexibility to really curate exactly how much paper I want to bring. And for this, less weight than a sketchbook, I can bring a lot more and bigger pieces of paper as well. Because I love to work usually 8x10 to 11x14. I do some 5x7s, like this little sketch of a glacier, because it was just too cold and I didn't have enough time with the glaciologist to do more than a small one. But other times I'll do a big giant 11x14 one, sometimes even bigger. It just kind of depends on how much time I have and how inspired I'm feeling. And also if I'm filming that class or filming that painting for a class, because this one was actually a lesson and it was probably the longest and most complex lesson I've ever filmed. And at first I didn't like the painting, I'll be honest. And I looked at it 6 months later and was like, I actually really like this now. I literally could not remember why I was so frustrated by it. But I think like one of my favorite things about painting outside is that whole kind of gamut of the experience, right? You have moments where like elation and success and everything's going right. And then everything goes sideways and I forget to paint 2 trees, right? And I think that whole kind of process is what I love about it, even if at moments it can feel kind of stressful, or the sun is going down and I have like 3 hours to hike back to camp like this one and I'm trying to hurry. And there's just so many things to consider when we're backpacking, but time management is especially a big one. And then I figured next I'll switch my camera view and can kind of talk a little bit more about the materials I carry and answer any questions about the materials before I share some of my favorite kind of tips and a couple techniques for kind of getting our brains thinking about working a bit more quickly when we're painting outside.
Oh, that sounds awesome, Claire. Thanks for the little overview. And I love your approach. And I appreciate, here we do have some questions. I was going to say, I appreciate, there's a tension for people of like, if they prefer loose leaf versus a sketchbook. And I do a little bit of both in my personal practice, where in the field, when I go out with a project or a goal, or like you, if I'm backpacking, loose leaf is lighter weight. And I have, sort of specific sizes I really like to work in. But then I find that having sketchbooks, especially in my studio and around town and like in my art toolkit, I use them to mess around. And that's where I just love to emphasize again, like it's the practice and not worrying, like, even if there's a piece where you're like, this isn't perfect, like, so what? But that can be hard as artists to let go of sometimes.
Yeah.
So here's a couple of questions. Betty's wondering about if you use gouache for the white or white of the paper.
In the vast majority of the paintings that I do, it's the white of the paper. The exception was in some of the photos one of the photos I showed you, it was the desert landscape. I've started to use a lot of gouache in desert landscapes, but far and above, I prefer the white of the paper just because when we use gouache, it changes the luminosity of the paint and the pigment in the paper. Like the most luminous appearance and feeling will come from just the pure white paper. Once we start adding an opaque pigment to that, the light no longer reflects in the same way from the page. So we literally lose that sense of kind of reflectivity and lightness. Which I don't mind in some paintings. I intentionally will do it in some, but I'm a big fan of leaving the white spaces. They can just tell so much of the story for us. That's one of the things I do a lot, actually. And I'll make a note to show you all what that is to leave intentionally very thin white lines between different parts of my painting. So I can be working on one section and the one below it. And as long as there's like the teeniest little white line in there, that I can be right next to each other. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment.
And sometimes those little white bits help sparkle through. Let's see. And here's another question is, do you use a flat surface? What flat surface for working?
Yes, I do.
Paper?
So that little envelope I showed you is going to do an okay job. This thing is it's not Billy Bendy. It has a piece of gator board or coroplast inside, which is it's just like plasticized, like it's a plastic cardboard basically. And it works amazing. Like you can buy it or you can get it from old political signs that are out of date. It's the same exact material. So you can just go out and pick one up and cut it to size and decide if it's a kind that you like or don't like, if you want to cut it up. And it's free and it's really wonderful.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, those are our questions so far. And do you want to switch to your overhead view and give us a little tour of some techniques?
Awesome. Let me go ahead and get this turned around. Just a moment, everybody. Okay, almost there.
There we go. Beautiful.
Okay, can you hear me okay, Maria?
I sure can.
Okay, awesome. There's a little button on Zoom I accidentally hit that was a microphone button, so I just want to make sure that it was still coming through my headphones and not through the the speakers on my phone. So just a couple of sketches here, and I'll just kind of show you the very minimal. I had a photo of it, but what do I carry? And if folks have any questions, just let me know. I don't want to spend too long just walking through info about every single one, unless so if you're curious, ask something. So I carry it all in a little waterproof ultralight baggie. I used to just carry it in a plastic bag, but I kept wearing out my Ziplocs too fast. So I found a really cool manufacturer in Oregon called Ultralight Sacks, and that's where I bought this little guy. And it's been super wonderful. It's a really high performance, I forget which ultralight fabric it is, but has some interesting acronyms with X's and C's and F's in it. And but it works great. And then inside of there, I have a paper towel. I learned about these from Maria, gosh, probably 9 years ago, which is the blue shop towels. Super reusable. I think I used the one she gave me for 4 years. You can just wash them, dry them, and then they're good to go again.
Oh,
this is that
so
tin.
Nice and
Yeah, and they just last forever. So that's so nice. Here's a tin for water, and you can see how I cannot hold much water in here because the hinges. So I can get maybe a half an inch of water in here before it starts to fall out. So I'm just really not making much waste water. I know some artists really, really care about having super clean water to work with and dirty water. I'm not that picky. I just wipe off most on here, and then this stays really, really clean. As far as a paintbrush, I adore just a number 10 round. If I'm doing paintings that are, 5x7, 8x10, I can usually do the whole painting with this. I started to add this little bit bigger brush. This is a larger, I don't know what number, it says a number 4, but some brushes have different naming systems. This is made by Black Gold. I buy it from a site called The Brush Guys. It's the only place that I've been able to find it. But I love this. I've been using it for a year, and it's actually held up really well to my abuses. I'm very hard on my paintbrushes. So that's why even though I have a couple really wonderfully nice, fancy brushes, I just don't take them in the field because they seem to wear out really fast on me. Part of that is that in my palette, I intentionally do not drop a bunch of water. Oftentimes you'll see artists, they'll take water from their palette and they'll drop a little drop of water here and then here, right, to kind of activate that color, or they'll put a lot of water in there. I found that in the Pacific Northwest, I just couldn't do that because otherwise my palette would just stay too wet and I would have to open it up in the vestibule of my tent at night or something to dry it out. So I end up kind of scrubbing into my colors a lot with my paintbrush just to lift out the amount of paint that I want. So I think that does account for a lot of the wear and tear on my paintbrushes. Because some of my paintbrushes get too dull on the tip and they can no longer do fine lines, I will occasionally throw in a number 6 round or number 4 just to have a smaller brush on the off chance that my paintbrush gets too worn down. Mechanical pencil, a kneaded eraser. For a long time, I used one of just these little plastic erasers, but they make little eraser junkies, and I got really tired of having to corral every eraser chunk into my bag because they're plastic, so I wasn't gonna leave it outside. So I finally switched to a kneaded eraser, even though they don't work quite as well for what I want to erase. But they're so much easier to use.
They're nice and then
yeah, and they're really they don't tear the paper or anything. And then for a long time, for a waterproof pen, I carried a micron pen. But I eventually found that I started to go through them too fast, especially when, and you'll laugh, Maria, I did use a sketchbook and I actually filled one. This was a little while ago. I started to do, about last spring, I did 100 days of an ink sketch every day. So I was just going through, and these were really wonderful because some of them turned out not as well. Some of them turned out really well. So it was that idea you were saying, Maria, practice, not perfection. And I just learned so much from doing this. And I think Like this was like midnight. I forgot to sketch that day. I was bound and determined not to miss a day. So I did a contour drawing of stuff on my table. And other times I was trying different inks. And I just love this practice so much because it really was about what you were saying, kind of non-attachment and just not caring how things turned out and just learning and exploring as I was going. And some are more complex, some more simple. So I did do a sketchbook and I'm excited. I got another one to start up using it again. Just because I think I learned so much. And when I look back on this exercise of sketching with ink, and importantly, I did not do any pencil sketch first. And I'll demo this for you in a moment. I just went right in with the ink pen. So there was no guidance. I had to just adjust a whole sketch and whatever on the fly if something didn't go the way I wanted it to. And I look back now and I really realized that my ability to sketch quickly and somewhat more accurately improved, I would say, at least by 50% during this activity.
Oh, that's inspiring, Claire.
Yeah.
What kind of sketchbook is that you're working in?
This is a Japanese sketchbook. I think it's made by a company called Midori. And also, I think it's in the link to this is on the resources page. So it should be eventually in the video or in the, I think in the comments for the video. It's really thin paper, but it's super duper smooth. So when I'm working with, as I eventually switched to a fountain pen and a brush pen, it's delightful to work on. The ink just flows so smoothly. There's almost no resistance on the paper. And since I was working every day, I kind of like that. And I also came to kind of adore just the unexpected things that would happen. Like being able to see the sketch below it just felt, I don't know, there was something uniquely satisfying. And I felt like the stories that told about what I was interested in practicing every day just became really interesting to me. And so, yeah, at first I disliked how thin the paper was. And I started really just appreciating how delightful that was and how it reflected what I was practicing every day. So if there's like one takeaway, just start doing some kind of sketching every day. And for these little tools here, I can show you the line quality just because I do like them a lot. This is a platinum desk pen. It's designed to be able to use their carbon ink, which it's a waterproof ink. So it has bigger particle sizes that can clog fountain pens. So do not put it in your expensive pens if you have them. But you can see that line quality is almost identical to a micron pen. Maybe ever so slightly more narrow, but on a thinner paper, it's a lot more consistent because it's not a felt tip. And then on the water brush side, when you use it, not a water brush, brush pen, when you use this on a smooth paper on a smooth paper, you're gonna have very smooth lines. On a rougher paper, you'll get some skipping like that. And that's totally fine. That just happens, right? I don't really worry about it. But again, on a smooth paper, you're gonna get just really delicious, bold, super thick and delightful lines. I think that about covers it. Oh, and the paper I carry primarily just pre-torn sheets of Arches 140-pound cold press. I'll have some weird sizes sometimes, like if I have scraps of paper, I'll throw them in just for fun. But for the vast majority of my paintings, I'm working in 8x10, 5x7, or 11x14, just because I prefer to have just a consistency across these, and it makes it easier just to not be overwhelmed by the options. And if I want a really weird narrow one, I can cut and tear these in the field if I want to. Were there any questions, Maria?
I have a couple of little questions. One is just backing up a little bit, that someone was curious if you might share the location of where that painting you shared that you weren't satisfied with, but later felt more satisfied.
Oh yeah, that one is out in the Mount Baker Wilderness. I'm looking at the Easton Glacier there. And it's a very, very sensitive alpine meadow. So I'm going to make the choice not to disclose the exact trail it's on, but with that information that you're looking at Mount Baker and the Easton Glacier with a map, you can easily find that location.
And Mary's wondering if you've ever tried a Fude pen for fountain pen.
I have not. That's the one with like the really interesting kind of curved nib, right?
Mm-hmm.
I haven't tried it, but I've been very curious. It's so funny because I bought a bunch of different like other size nibs for pens and everything, but I ended up not using them. I gave them to my sister. I'm very much an artist and just a person in general that when I find something that works, I just stick to it. And then I'm not too inclined to want to switch. I'm the same way with like the number of paints in my palette for the longest time. And Maria, you'll laugh. Like I resisted adding colors to my palette because I just was happy with what I had. And then last summer I went through and I got these from Daniel Smith because I'm using all Daniel Smith paints. You can buy their little dot cards with little samples of each of their paints. I think it's like, I can try to include a link here for folks. I think it was like 25 or $35 or something. I got the most hours of entertainment out of that $35 than I ever have in my life. Like I had so much fun exploring all the colors. And I eventually did add a couple new colors to my palette, and it's been really fun and also challenging. Like I added an orange and a violet and then a different violet color, and it's really, really fun and good for me as an artist to like, here's my color comfort zone and be like, now we're over here.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I'm enjoying seeing your folio palette, because for so long you had warm and cool pocket palettes, and now you're moved into a folio.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I do carry, I will mention, I'll occasionally add some auxiliary materials, especially in the desert. I'll add in a pencil that has a even darker tip to it, or darker lead, so I can shade more if I want to. I'll add in an angled or a flat paintbrush. And these two, the brush and the gouache. I will also add an extra little mixing palette. So I used to have just 2 of these in the size. And then I got excited to mix something else in here, but normally it's just for the mixing with the gouache. Because I'm not a clean palette person. This is clean for me right now. I just cleaned it a little while ago. Some artists I know can keep their palette looking just pristine and gorgeous, and I am 10,000% not that person. My palette is always delightfully messy, and then I'll just like clean individual pans as I go along once I get home from a day trip or something. But having a little guy for the gouache has helped so much, because then I can just literally squeeze, from this tube, fresh gouache here, and then not worry about it being all up in my mixing space. Okay, any other questions about materials before I talk a little bit about some of my favorite kind of little activities while I'm thinking about sketching outside?
I think we are set to go.
Okay, we'll put this aside, so I'm not going to do gouache here today, put these aside as well. So one of my favorite exercises is that when I'm on the trail, I play a game, I call it the color game in my head. And it's with that game, if I need to entertain myself while I'm on the trail, let's say I'm looking at like this scene of Mount Baker, right? Here's a little painting of it. And I've been hiking this trail right here. I will be envisioning in my mind, what are the colors I would use to mix that? So obviously you have to have kind of a baseline impression of, a baseline understanding of the different colors in your palette. But let's say if I'm imagining the beautiful color of the blueberry bushes, I'll kind of in my head be thinking like, is it this color? Is it perline red? I think so, but maybe it's my pea-roll scarlet. Nope, definitely not that color. And I'll know my colors well enough that I can kind of envision this and like, is it going to be orange? Definitely not that color. So I'll literally be like, this is like the color. It's a very simplistic dialogue, but it's really fun because I'll be like, okay, once I have the base color, what happens if I want kind of that well, my yellow is all dirty, but what happens maybe if I want to have the kind of the orange and it wasn't that orange, maybe it's these two together. And yes, there is that really kind of dark, deep reddish orange for the blueberries. And then in my head, I'll kind of wonder to myself, like, is it ultramarine blue that's the color for some of the shadows? Maybe, or is it cobalt blue? I just literally, I have color conversations in my head. If my compatriots while we're hiking are very bored, I will like externalize the quiet conversation and entertain everybody with my apparently sometimes funny color dialogue.
That's wonderful.
Color,
and
yeah.
Claire, I know people are going to be curious what colors are in your palette. Can you send them afterwards and we'll put them in the chat or in the description?
There's a lot of them. So I think the best way to do it actually is I have a YouTube video where I swatch out every color. I think we could just include that link. That might be the most efficient way to do it. Because there's I forget how many this one can hold, like 27 or something.
Yeah, you've got more because you've got some minis in there. So
yeah, I have a couple of funky.
You probably have at least 30 paints in there. Okay, cool. So we'll include a link to Claire's video. So if you're curious about all her colors, you can go check that out.
Yeah, and I use the little tiny pans, little mini pans as kind of a space to try out unusual colors that I'm really not sold on yet. Like this is a nickel azo yellow, I think. This is jadeite. This one's viridian, and I've had viridian for a while, but it got demoted from a full pan. And that was kind of a mixed color. It got demoted because I just wasn't using it enough. So there's the color viridian. And of course, I also have this phthalo blue green shade. My phthalo colors, I laugh and talk about them as having the personalities of the kind of people that if you're at a show or a bar late at night and like the bouncer's trying to close it down, the phthalo blues and greens are the ones that are dancing on the counter still. Because they just like to dominate. Yeah, they just like to dominate the mixture so much. I mean, if I drop a little bit into viridian, like eventually that pigment will just totally overpower that beautiful subtle green. So I don't know. I think they all have personalities, and I think some of those personalities have arisen just from how many hours I think I spend making up color mixtures in my head. And when I added new colors, that made my color mixing game even harder and more fun because I have this new one like quinacridone violet right here. And this is just such a delightful color. It dries a bit more subtly than what you see right there, but it mixes with things like quinacridone gold. It makes just some of these perfect colors for what I was seeing when I was at Petrified Forest National Park as their artist in residence. These like really bizarre kind of brownish, but still really colorful. Kind of they all like they look brown until you look at them closely, then they're definitely not brown. They're purples and yellows and even greens and blues in these pieces of petrified wood. So that color was an unexpected and really wonderful addition. And I think that's why it's been really fun to add a couple of new colors and just get to explore those. So I love doing the color game. And then sometimes I'll, if I'm really, really like unhappy on the trail, well, okay, I'm never unhappy, but if I'm suffering with a big uphill, I will move on in my game from just imagining color mixes to starting to think about actual compositions and how I might sketch or draw something. And sometimes that can be as simple as, if I'm thinking about maybe I'm walking by wildflowers and I know I'm going to be wanting to sketch one, I'll just try to start looking for in that flower, what are the most kind of dominant shapes that I keep seeing over and over again. And what that does is that as I'm kind of observing these parts of a landscape or a flower or a piece of nature really closely while I'm walking and thinking about the lines and shapes, then when I come to my page, sometimes I'll challenge myself and just try to not even have a pencil sketch first, just like I did for that 100-day project in my sketchbook. And I think that there's something so powerful about this exercise. And people who, you may recall me talking about sketchbooks and being intimidated by having stuff feel so permanent. And then yet here I am going right in with ink, right? And this is kind of, I think, my way of combating what I know is a kind of mental block I can have about worrying about something being too precious or perfect. So just kind of going into something, and if I make a little line, like if I don't think it's quite right, I'll just draw the line next to it that is where I want it to be. And just think of each of those extra lines in a sketch like this as a record of what I was interested in or curious about within that flower or that landscape. So it's such a powerful activity, and I encourage my students all the time just to try this because it's so fun and it's kind of freeing to go right in with pen and just not be able to change anything. I think, Maria, you've done a direct watercolor painting challenge a number of years, right? Where you don't do any ink or prep beforehand and just go in with paint. And I haven't gotten quite there yet.
Yeah, but I love the direct with pen too, because it takes away the tentativeness of, I'm going to go in with pencil and then erase it and go over with pen. It's a lot faster. And I always just tell myself, like you said, if you draw a line and it's not exactly where you want it, just adjust it. And it's just a record of what you were exploring and seeing. And then if you just paint, if you're adding color, paint within the lines you want. And the other lines will kind of disappear if they're outside the area you were painting, or if they're inside, they're just going to be painted. And I rarely notice them. So I really encourage people to dive in with pen and try it, especially if it feels a little uncomfortable. I think it can be healthy to do things that feel a little uncomfortable, at least when it comes to our art practice. Push our comfort zones.
And I love the way you articulated that, I hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms, that of course you can just, the lines are just there when we put paint in, and I might even throw a little bit of paint in here so folks can see that, because it's so freeing. Like that's a weird line, that little horizontal one, but who cares? Like that, you won't even be able to really see it once we go in and put the beautiful color in here. So that was I always learn so much from talking to other artists, and it's always fun for me to hang out with them too.
Cindy was just wanting to ask too, do you carry your larger folio palette on your hikes or the smaller one? I know you showed you have that extra mixing area. Are those sort of your standard for your trip?
Yeah. The folio palette now, like I think for a little while, I thought that maybe I would go back to the smaller ones, but then I became attached to having the entire color rainbow with me. So now I carry it. And honestly, it's the same exact weight, I think, as the two, as I was carrying two of the pocket palettes before. So now it's just easier for me, because before I'd have to stack one palette here and one palette here, and they would kind of slide on each other a little bit. So it's far more simple knowing I want to have that variety of colors, just to have the bigger one with me, and I can just tape it to my board if the painting is small enough. Otherwise, I'll balance it on a rock, or I find the funniest places to perch my palettes. And as long as it doesn't end up in sand, I don't mind. The sand it takes a unique amount of time to clean out a palette that had a bunch of wet paint, and if you get sand in it,
I understand that. Spending lots of times on beaches.
Oh gosh, and you have a kid, I'm sure. My friends who have dogs always complain. I feel like kids could be just as sandy.
Definitely.
So I think I'll just throw a little bit of color in here for fun. So I'm using a quinacridone rose and some cobalt blue. This is one of my favorite mixtures for lupin. It's just, you can make this beautiful subtle purple by adding more of my blue to a mixture and then more of the pink. I can just kind of get a really deep, nice blue. But because cobalt blue is overall kind of a less saturated color, it never feels so overbearing in my mixtures that it still kind of maintains that kind of lightness that I feel like, for me, characterizes lupin flowers. And whenever I'm in the field, I like to work as quickly as I can, right? I'm not someone who's shy about putting color down. And if it's I'll often test it on a piece of scrap paper or below if I have color swatches. And I try to just drop that color in kind of as fast as I can, because then if I get that color in, then I can come back and I can, right while stuff is still wet, then I can start adding in some blue and I can get stuff to mix on with like within and inside of my flowers. I'll leave some little white spaces for them. And it's kind of, I think, that wet and wet mixing that just creates some of the more magical effects of watercolor. So I'm always trying to look for ways to encourage that to happen within my paintings. And I'll make it a little more purple here instead of just a blue purple. And I'm working right here on just a piece of Canson XL watercolor paper. So I'm not going to get quite as long of a dry time as I might have gotten on if I was working on cotton paper. So I'll just, stuff will take a little bit longer, like take less time basically to dry. So dropping some of that in. And the flowers are usually kind of more purplish, sometimes up top and more bluish-ish, sometimes down below. I'll lean back and say, okay, like that feels pretty good. I like the little white spaces in the pink. And if I want to get rid of some of the pink, I can just put some blue right next to it. It'll kind of blend in there and change the appearance. And then, while this is all still wet, I'm just going to go right in and take some of my cobalt blue and some Hansa yellow medium and mix up a color for my leaves. And I'm just not going to worry about it. Like if I get some green that goes into a leaf, so be it. I don't care. I mean, my goal, especially when I'm backpacking or working outside at any time, is just to get kind of the impression of what I'm seeing. Like I don't want to get so bogged down in thinking about being perfect that I don't sketch at all, which can happen sometimes. So instead, I'm just like, all right, it'll be good enough, and just trust that whatever I was doing my best, and I'm going to have a fun kind of I'll have a sketch of some kind when I'm done. And like I'm getting some cool blending of green into that flower petal. That's kind of fun. So instead of seeing them as mistakes, I just try to see it as moments of color mixing or color play that really reflect what I was interested in and what I was curious about in that landscape.
Beautiful, Claire.
There's a little demo of some lupin, and again, I just love the direct ink onto the page. I think that just feels so fun. And I wanted to share kind of one other little sketching activity that I do a lot when I'm in the field. And that is to do a thumbnail sketch of different, get some water here on the page. And I love thumbnail sketches for so many reasons, but they're also something you can do in your head while you're hiking along if you need some entertainment. And I think they just also really are a powerful tool for dialing in composition and just kind of letting ourselves explore a landscape without the stress of maybe even pulling out our paints necessarily for a sketch. It can just be in pencil or pen.
And before you, I never
questions?
thought of using the palette for a template. I just, after seeing that, I was like, wow.
I'm glad you brought it up. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, so I don't carry a ruler when I'm outside. I just use my palettes as my straight edges because I brought a ruler once and I lost it and then probably felt terrible about leaving a clear plastic eraser behind. So I just switched to the palettes and they work great, right? Like they're a straight edge. So I just use those, and they also make nice little rectangles. So when people know that, then they'll look at my pages, right? And they're like, oh, there's the standard top pocket palette, and this is like 3 or 2 of the bigger ones across, that kind of thing. So it works for sure. So a thumbnail sketch, is just a simplified version of what we're seeing in our landscape. And I do these all the time. They adorn my story sketch pages. They adorn the backs of things. Sometimes, and very often, especially in my sketching pages, they'll become a permanent part of the composition. They're kind of a warm up for me and help me decide what am I most interested in a landscape. And this painting is interesting because it was really, really humid where I was, not warm, but it was just a high moisture content. So I got these really beautiful and much more kind of subtle and striated blooming patterns throughout this whole painting in a way that it's way hard to do for me in the studio sometimes. Like that effect just doesn't really want to cooperate. And you can also see the little white line separation technique. And anywhere where this wet layer here touched this layer where I lost the white line, I get that bleeding of the colors across that little border. But it's a really, really powerful tool. And it just saves me so much time because instead of having to paint this and wait for it to dry, and then paint this and wait for it to dry, I can paint this and then like this one dried enough, and then I can go to here, and I do it all the time. Here's another example here from another painting where it was raining. Literally raining. You can see all the little droplets in this painting were tiny little raindrops that dropped on my page. And again, that border just allowed me to literally do the whole painting in way less time than if I had worried about it, because this painting didn't dry until I brought it in the tent with me and we sat together for about 10 minutes.
Claire, Susan shared that those white lines can be called paper dams. I like that term. Thought you'd enjoy that.
I love that. I hadn't thought about that. I was describing them as like paper traffic cops, but paper dams makes much more sense. Oh, I love that. Yeah, and white line, it was actually, I learned recently, there was a school of, or like a number of printmakers who were doing like woodblock prints. They called it white line printing in the Northwest. And I forget the names of some of the printmakers, but you can actually see that same thing appear in different prints from folks, which is really cool in the 1990s, I think, or thereabouts. So for a thumbnail sketch, I always just start with kind of the biggest shape that I see. And sometimes it's the foreground, sometimes it's gonna be a background mountain, just to kind of get down the biggest thing. And then, I'll go from there and say, okay, here's some ridges and mountains, and here's some more ridges and mountains. And I won't worry too much about having all this be perfect. I'm just trying to explore and get warmed up and play and test out a composition, because maybe I look at this and say, you know what, that's kind of boring. Maybe in my painting I'm going to do, I actually want there to be a tree here, and then I can put a tree in there. And I can sketch that in. And sometimes they can stay literally this simple. Like on the backs of some of my paintings, when I'm outside trying to decide what I want to paint, this is what adorns the back of it, are just a bunch of little sketches with almost nothing to them, but just lines as I try out different compositions over and over again until I really dial in what I'm interested in. Other times I might get excited and think it'd be fun to come back in and use some of my other tools, especially if I'm working on one of my story sketch pages where I do have kind of that interdisciplinary combination of sketches and watercolor and words. That's when I like to come back in here and be able to, finalize some of the sketches to kind of help tell the story of that experience and that place that I was in. So in that case, I might make these more formal with some ink or darker pencil lines. When I know I'm going to be carrying the painting for quite a while, I will use ink in these sketches just because the pencil tends to get a little bit smeared around on the page. So I might, keep the darker, that lovely brush pen for the foreground. Then in our little sketches, we can really easily create depth and a sense of kind of things being closer to us and things being farther away, just by playing with how much shading we do. And you'll notice I'm turning my page here because I have a really hard time when I'm perfectly perpendicular to my body, making straight up and down lines. Like I can do it now as I've had some practice from teaching, but it's not that easy. For whatever reason, my hand and body works better if I turn the page, because then I can just go really, really fast across the paper. And I also obviously have gotten a lot faster at this after doing it for 100 days. I was very, very tentative with my lines in the beginning. And sometimes I'll even kind of scrub the tip of the pen just literally up and down across the page. And then as I come into an area like right here where I want those lines to be more precise, and then I'll just kind of slow down a little bit. And I can just shade this whole zone here. And again, I'm going pretty, like by having my lines closer together, that's going to give the impression of kind of a darker shading pattern in there. And I can turn it back right side up and reinforce this upper line. And as I go backwards, I just progressively start to space out the lines that I'm creating in my sketch until they get farther and farther apart with each layer. And that will help kind of send those background layers a little bit farther back and keep the foreground layers a little bit more prominent, until in the back layer back here, I may not even have full vertical lines up and down. I just have a couple little hints of lines, little baby lines. And I'm often asked, why vertical lines? I don't have a good answer for you other than I like the way they looked. And it was,
that's what we got to do, is develop our artistic voices. So, the more you see what appeals to you. Claire, we've got a question from Cindy about how you store your individual pieces of paper once they are painted.
Good question. So as soon as they are dry, they just get tucked right into my Tyvek sleeve here. And I can fit a ton of paintings in here. Like I recently, on a trip last summer, I had a big 11 by 14 for my every day for 9 days. And they just live in there. And then I don't worry about them. Like I just paint right on top of the surface. This is my painting surface. I have tape on here for if it's windy. If I have sometimes I will try to be, even though paint, I've never had it soak through, I'll often have one side that is the unpainted on papers, like over here be the new paper and over here is the finished paintings. And then I'm always painting on the same side with the new paper below it as just like extra insurance to make sure nothing bleeds through, even though I never had that happen.
And then
these last a very long time.
Big boxes that you like to store your stuff in?
Yeah, so I wish I had the beautiful, lovely flat file cabinets. I just don't have space for one. So inside the studio, once I'm back from a trip, I'll kind of collect like all the field paintings from a summer. And if they're all kind of the same size, I'll tuck them in some of these Tyvek envelopes to keep them arranged by like month or by trip or by residency. Or if they're a bunch of big paintings, I'll use the big, you know how when you order sheets of paper, it comes in plastic? I save and use all of those to store paintings, and those go inside of the boxes that my paper was shipped in. And I can fit a ton of paintings in there. I label all the boxes, and I tuck some of those little, little desiccant packets you get with clothing sometimes, the moisture absorbers. I'll put a couple of those along the edges of the boxes. And that's just kind of a little extra insurance that on the off chance that moisture was kind of in the ambient air in my space, it helps protect the paintings. I never use, of course, don't use desiccant packets that came with food products of any kind, only stuff that came clean with like clothing or boots or something.
Great idea. Great idea. Well, gosh, Claire, this has just been flying by, and I just love everything you shared. I'm feeling super inspired myself. And I wonder, in just our last few minutes, maybe you want to pull up your face again and share a little bit about the different ways we can follow your work, and we can see if there's any last questions.
Sounds good. Let me get this turned around for us. Okay, let's see here. Let's close down that and start video and turn that little buddy around. And there we go.
Yay!
Yay! Hello again.
Here, I'll pull you this. Let's see here.
I can move my very bright light off to the side.
There we go.
Awesome. Yeah. And people, if you want a couple last questions, feel free to drop them in. But so thank you everybody for joining us. This is like one of my favorite topics, so near and dear to my heart, to talk about, tools for exploration, whether that's going to be sitting in our car, looking out at a viewpoint, or backpacking a super long distance. I just get so excited about all those different ways of interacting with place. And if you would like to see more of my work, my kind of portfolio and storytelling website is going to be the claireswanderings.com. I have a blog that I'm starting to use more. That's The Art of Hiking. And that's also the name for my YouTube channel, where I've started to share some fun videos that kind of go behind the scenes on some of my art residency experiences, alongside of more kind of educational or informative or just relaxing content, like color swatching every color and talking about the personalities that each one has and how I use them and how some of them I love and some of them I don't, but I still keep them. So I'd love to see you on any of those spaces. And then if you would like to learn to paint with me, I every month share a step-by-step watercolor class that I've created outside and on site somewhere. And sometimes those classes will be filmed 20 feet from the parking lot. And then other times I'll be in the middle of a backpacking trip or on a hike in the desert. And those classes are called the Adventure Art Academy. And I would love to see you there. You can sign up anytime and try it out for however many months you would like to. I try to keep it kind of as easy and flexible for folks as possible. And I will also do, kind of bonus one-off workshops and stuff. But my current students in the Adventure Art Academy always get access to my other classes if just I'm hosting them. So they kind of get some bonus content every once in a while.
Oh, that's so wonderful. And we'll also put in a link down here. We've had demos before with Claire. As we've said, we're old friends, and we can put a link to that. And to stay tuned to our newsletter. And Claire, I hope that we'll have you again. We've had you in the past teach with us. And so hoping we can.
So one of the classes was this guy.
Yeah, that was a really fun one with our Art Toolkit workshops. If any of you haven't yet subscribed to our newsletter, that's the best place to hear about our upcoming events and specials. Like I mentioned, tomorrow in the newsletter, we'll be announcing when our next round of the Icy Fjords palette will be available, which, as we talked about in the beginning, was a program that Claire participated with over 10 years ago, where we actually first met. So I just want to thank everyone for being with us today. Claire, thank you for sharing your time and talents with us, and look forward to being in touch with you all. And happy painting, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And don't be shy about reaching out. My email for students or folks that find me in places like this is claire@adventureartacademy.com. And I love hearing from you. And this is a good time of year to reach out to me, because I'm actually home and in the studio. Once I hit the summer, I'm usually gone for a lot of the year. I spent 100 days at residencies or in the field last summer. So if you have questions and would like to get a hold of me, springtime and fall time and winter time is definitely the ideal.
Wow. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for coming.
All right. Live stream just